Welcome back to another exciting episode of COP29 podcast series, where we bring global experts to discuss the most pressing issues on climate change, sustainability, and innovation. This podcast is brought to you in collaboration with Michigan State University and Impact Azerbaijan. I am your host, Gulnara, in this episode. Today, we are honored to be joined by Felix Finkbeiner, a leading German environmentalist, climate advocate, and founder of Plant for the Planet, a global movement that has already planted millions of trees across the world. Felix's journey began at just 9 years old when he realized the urgent need to take action against climate change. Since then, he has become a prominent voice for youth in the fight for climate justice and sustainability. Through his work with Plant for the Planet, Felix has empowered young people to take a stand for the environment, and his efforts have reached far beyond his native Germany, inspiring youth led climate movement globally. He has spoken at various high level international platforms, including the United Nations, urging world leaders to take immediate and meaningful action on climate change. Felix's unwavering belief in the power of youth activism and his commitment to climate justice make him an ideal guest for today's podcast. And we dive into the topic of youth and climate advocacy and explore the crucial role that young people play in pushing for climate justice and action. Felix, thank you for joining us today. We are excited to hear your insight and experiences.
Thank you very much for having me.
As a prominent youth leader in the environmental movement, what do you think is the unique power of young people when it comes to pushing for climate action?
I think it's really two things. On the one hand, there's nothing that special about young people, but we need every voice out there to jointly push for this incredibly important topic. The danger with the climate crisis is that it's such a long term crisis. It's never the most immediate, the most current crisis to fix. It's always something that maybe we'll tackle this next year. So we really need everyone to continuously work on refocusing our attention on this issue. On the other hand, it is the young people that will suffer most from the consequences of the climate crisis. It'll be in our lifetimes where we really see the peak of these consequences. So I think because of that, young people, children, and youth can be very authentic and very clear voices in focusing attention on this issue.
How do you see the involvement of young people in shaping the global climate dialogue and encourage governments to adopt stronger policies?
For the past decade or two, a lot of young NGOs have tried to influence the global climate negotiations, especially through the UNFCCC, the International Climate Change Negotiation Process. It's incredibly hard to say in retrospect how much of a difference these voices have made. I think part of the activism around these climate conferences that young people have done have increased international attention for these conferences, which probably increases the pressure that government negotiators feel towards coming to a result. But other than that, seeing the exact impact is hard to say for sure.
Justice is a key issue for many young activists. How do you define climate justice, and why do you believe it is essential for young people to lead the charge on this topic?
I think climate justice at its heart is a very simple idea and very obvious idea, really, once you think about it, which is that the people that will suffer most from the consequences of the climate crisis are not the ones most responsible for causing it. It's particularly global north countries that have historically emitted the most greenhouse gases and are still today emitting the most. But for a range of reasons, partially the wealth in these global north countries, in countries like Germany, where I come from, and also because of the more temperate climate in these regions, the consequences here are actually the lowest. People that are going to be affected most are in the global south, especially in the African and Southeast Asian countries. So, what climate justice means, or the consequences from this, is that one, we obviously have to address this problem as urgently as possible. But two, we also particularly have to help these vulnerable communities to adapt to the consequences of this crisis and help ameliorate the consequences as much as possible.
In what ways can young people help ensure that climate action includes marginalized communities who are disproportionately affected by climate change?
In these international climate negotiations, the governments of the world have made an increasing effort at integrating youth voices, but of course, young people most capable of accepting these invites and these opportunities are young people from wealthier countries. So organizations like ours, like Plan for the Planet, but obviously all our peers, they will have to really make an effort to make sure that these opportunities are equitably distributed, and we find ways for young people from global south countries, but also from other marginalized and disadvantaged communities within our countries to be included in these processes and also be heard.
While youth activism has grown, it's not always easy for young people to make their voices heard. What are some of the biggest challenges young climate advocates face, and how can they overcome them?
There are a range of challenges here. One really important part is obviously subject expertise. To really meaningfully contribute to these negotiations, you need to get quite into the weeds on the subject matter discussed. And those are complex. We're 29 years into these international climate negotiations now, 29 years of agreement texts that need to be understood and that provide the context for each additional round of negotiations. Obviously, you don't have to be an expert on all of this, and it is differentiated out in different negotiation streams and so on. But still, to really help come to effective agreements, you need to dive quite deep into that material. There are some and increasingly more opportunities that help young people get involved and to learn and understand all that, but still quite tricky.
How do you see the future of climate advocacy evolving? Like, what role do you see for young people in shaping the next chapter of climate action?
I think the biggest challenge right now is that our topic, climate change, has massively receded from public attention. I think 2018 to 2020 was sort of the peak where, thanks to the Fridays for Future movements and lots of wonderful work from a range of young activists, climate change was uniquely, potentially for the first time, but hopefully not for the last time, um, at the forefront of the political agenda in many countries. Not everywhere, of course, but many countries in Western Europe, in particular, really focus on the topic for a while. But no such movement lasts forever, and there are a range of reasons that influence has waned. And now, because of all the new challenges, new international challenges we're facing, those violent conflicts in many countries, etc. This topic has really receded.
What advice would you give to other young people, like who are looking to get involved in environmental activism but are not sure where to start?
Yeah, I think getting familiar, like there are so many different things to do in the climate change space, so many areas to contribute that I can totally see how that can be overwhelming. But there are a lot of fantastic youth environmental organizations and climate organizations around the world. So if I were new to the space, I'd Google around, find some near me, and explore and learn from others there first, and see that as the initial step.
Felix, as a young climate advocate, how did it feel to be part of such a significant global event like COP29 in Baku?
I think mostly it's a very sobering experience. When you look at these processes from a far distance, you sort of maybe don't fully realize the entire humanness of the process. But the closer you get, and if you watch this from a front row seat, you can really appreciate that international failure for what it is. It is really disappointing. What we had at the end of that conference is a vague legislative um, agreement that maybe reached what it set out to at the beginning of the conference in achieving an international goal of climate funding to provide. But if you really take a step back, those results are incredibly limited. There are no concrete goals for each country what to contribute when. There's very little that we can really hold countries against in measuring the implementation. There are no specific requirements for countries, but these vague overall goals with very, very serious chances that they're not going to be met. And even if they were met, they're still far too little.
As a leader of Plant for the Planet, what are your plans for coming years? How do you want to work in climate change topic in future, and what is your let's say plan for coming years?
There's really two things. On the one hand, we're going to continue focusing on our day-to-day work of trying to restore forests around the world. But more related to our conversation here, we also are trying to positively impact international negotiations beyond what we can achieve ourselves to really get governments of the world to address the climate crisis more seriously. Our focus in that regard is quite specifically on funding the conservation and restoration of the world's forests, which is obviously very important for biodiversity, but particularly for addressing the climate crisis. And there are a couple of these mechanisms that are currently being discussed that are on the table of ways we can help fund the protection of the world's rainforests. One such mechanism is the Tropical Forest Funding Facility. The idea is that we create this international fund that global north countries pay into and then invest that money, and with the proceeds of that money we fund um, we incentivize tropical countries to better protect their rainforests. This is a very interesting idea pitched by a group of global south countries, global south rainforest countries, particularly Brazil and Colombia are there in the driver's seat. And it's a very promising way we can really begin funding rainforest conservation at scale. And I think there's a big opportunity that it'll meaningfully help protect our rainforests. So what we're trying to do is convince the German government and the European Union to get behind this program and help set it up.
You participated in COP29, and I hope that you will be part of COP30 in Brazil as well. Do you have any plan? Like, what do you want to bring COP30? Like, what is your idea? You think that it will be helpful to bring to the agenda?
Yeah, COP29, sorry, COP30 is going to be in Brazil, and one of the important, but certainly not only topic there is the protection of rainforests. And the goal that Brazil and Colombia have set out together with their partner countries is that this institution, the Tropical Forest Funding Facility, will be launched there at COP30. So we're working hard to convince these European institutions and European governments to get behind that. Of course, we're only doing a very small part here. The biggest heavy lifting here is is being done by Brazil and Colombia and some other governments there, but we're going to do our small part in hopefully contributing to this institution being set up.
What message would you like to send to young people listening to this podcast who want to follow in your footsteps and make a tangible impact at events like COP29?
I think I'd encourage young people interested in impacting climate policy to think very specifically about whether these international climate negotiations are the place they can make the biggest impact, or whether national and state legislation might be a bigger lever. A lot of focus does go to these international negotiations, and in some countries that also happens at the national level, in countries like the US, for instance. But if you live in a democratic country and you have the ability to talk to state actors at the national level about these topics, you might have a much bigger impact, especially in smaller countries. Way too few people are paying attention to the details of the policy work happening locally. So that's not to say that the UNFCCC international negotiations are unimportant. They obviously are important in setting these global benchmarks, but your country's policies are too. What gives me hope is all the other progress we've made in recent years. Well, international climate diplomacy hasn't yielded huge gains in the last couple of years. There's some other developments that are really promising. Number one is that a lot of the key technology we need to address the climate crisis has become radically cheaper in the last 2 decades. Think about solar panels, think about wind power, battery technology, and so on. So fixing the climate crisis, stopping the climate crisis is now much, much cheaper than we would have ever dreamed of 20 years ago. And in some other areas like stopping deforestation, we've made significant progress. The Brazilian government is a fantastic example for that. In the last 2 years, deforestation rates in Brazil have gone down by half. Enormous progress that really shows how much we can achieve if we take these challenges seriously. So a lot of good things have happened in recent years, but of course, it goes without saying that it's not happening fast enough to achieve our international climate goals.
Thank you very much, Felix. It was great to have you here with us. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much for having me.